The nobleman's screams echoed through the stone corridors, but no one came to his aid. His attackers held him down, their hands steady, their faces devoid of mercy. The blade flashed once, twice, and the unthinkable was done. His testicles, severed from his body, were forced into his own mouth, a grotesque mockery of his former power. This was not just torture, it was annihilation. Who was this man, and why did he suffer such an unspeakable fate? He was no common criminal, no low-born thief. He was a noble, a man of influence, whose name once commanded respect. But power is fragile, and enemies are made in the shadows. Perhaps he crossed the wrong king, betrayed the wrong ally, or simply stood in the way of someone's ambition. Whatever the reason, his downfall was orchestrated with precision, not just to kill him, but to erase his dignity, to make him a warning to others. The act itself was calculated. Mutilation was common in the brutal politics of the time, but this was different. Cutting off a man's genitals was one thing, forcing him to consume them was another. It was a message, written in blood and suffering. This is what happens to those who defy us. The pain would have been unbearable, the humiliation absolute. Did he beg? Did he curse his tormentors? Or did he endure in silence, knowing his fate was sealed? And what of his end? Did he die there, choking on his own flesh? Or did they let him live broken, ruined, as a walking testament to their cruelty? If he survived, his life would never be the same. His name, once proud, would forever be tied to this horror. His family, if they dared to claim him, would carry the shame for generations. This was not justice. This was power, asserting itself in the most visceral way possible. And as we look back, we must ask, how many others suffered in silence? How many stories were erased by the victors? The past is not just a record of kings and battles. It is also written in the blood of those who fell beneath the blade, and some wounds never truly heal. The nobleman in question was no ordinary figure. He was a man of power, influence, and ultimately, a man who made deadly enemies. His name has been lost to some histories, deliberately erased, but his fate remains a chilling testament to the brutality of vengeance. He belonged to a high-ranking family, likely involved in the treacherous political machinations of his time. Whether he was a schemer himself, or simply caught in the crossfire of rival factions, one thing is certain: he offended the wrong people. This was an era where power was not just about wealth or titles, it was about dominance, humiliation, and sending a message that would echo through generations. The nobleman's crime, whether real or fabricated, was severe enough to warrant not just execution, but a punishment designed to strip him of dignity, manhood, and identity. His attackers were not common thugs, they were likely men of similar standing, perhaps even former allies, who saw his destruction as necessary. The act itself was calculated. Testicles were not just removed, they were forced into his mouth, a grotesque symbolism that spoke of silencing him, of reducing him to nothing more than the very essence of his masculinity, consumed by his own shame. This was not merely torture, it was a statement, a warning to others who might dare cross the same line. Did he survive? Unlikely. Even if he lived through the initial mutilation, infection, shock, or the sheer psychological devastation would have claimed him soon after. His name, if not erased entirely, became synonymous with disgrace. His family, if they dared to speak of him at all, would have done so in whispers. This was not just violence, it was theater, a performance of power meant to be remembered, and centuries later, we still do. The assailants were not common criminals, they were men of calculated cruelty, acting with purpose. Some sources suggest they were hired mercenaries, others claim they were rival nobles settling a blood feud. But one thing is certain, they knew exactly what they were doing and why. Power was at the heart of this act. The nobleman had crossed a line, perhaps by betraying an oath, seizing land, or humiliating the wrong family. His enemies didn't just want him dead, they wanted him broken, erased. The mutilation was a message, carved into flesh for all to see. The method was deliberate. Testicles, symbols of lineage and virility, were not just removed, they were forced into his mouth. A grotesque inversion, the source of his legacy, now silenced him. Some accounts say he was conscious during the act, others claim he was drugged, left to wake in horror. Either way, the intent was clear. This was not just murder, it was annihilation. Who gave the order? A rival lord, a vengeful king, The truth is buried in whispers, but the brutality suggests someone who understood the weight of symbols. This was not mere savagery, it was political theater, designed to terrify. And it worked. The story spread. Men who heard it clutched their own bodies in reflexive dread. The nobleman's name became a warning. His enemies had not just killed him, they had rewritten his story in blood and shame. But here's the chilling question that lingers. Was this punishment unique? Or was it just one act in a long, dark tradition of power asserting itself through pain? Think on that. History has more screams than it does answers. The act itself was not just violence, it was a message, carved into flesh and left for history to remember. The nobleman, already restrained and stripped of dignity, was held down by men whose faces he likely recognized. There was no blindfold, no mercy to spare him the sight of what came next. The blade was sharp, the hand steady. First the excruciating cut, deliberate, slow enough to maximize pain, fast enough to prevent him from passing out too soon. The screams were muffled, either by a gag or by the sheer force of hands clamping over his mouth. Blood soaked the ground beneath him, hot and thick. But the true horror came after the severing. His own severed testicles were forced into his mouth, a grotesque symbolism, a mockery of his manhood, his lineage, his very identity. The act was not just about pain, it was about humiliation so profound it would echo beyond his death. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy us. The method was calculated. No hurried butcher's work. This was ritual, theater. The perpetrators knew exactly what they were doing. Some accounts suggest he was kept alive during the ordeal, forced to taste his own mutilation, to understand the full weight of his defeat. Others claim he bled out quickly, a small mercy in an otherwise merciless act. But why this method? Why not a simple execution? Because power isn't just about killing, it's about breaking. The mutilation was a statement, a warning to any who might follow in his footsteps. His suffering was a lesson, written in blood and flesh. And when it was over, his body, if it was even returned, was no longer just a corpse. It was a relic of terror, a thing to be whispered about in the halls of those who had ordered it. The act itself became his legacy, overshadowing whatever he had been before. History remembers the brutality far more than the man, and perhaps that was the point. The nobleman lay in a pool of his own blood, his body broken, his dignity stripped away, but the worst was yet to come. The question wasn't whether he would survive the mutilation. The question was whether he would even want to. After the blades had done their work, after his tormentors had carried out their grotesque punishment, the nobleman was left in a state beyond agony. His testicles had been severed and forced into his mouth, a deliberate act of humiliation, a message carved into flesh. But what happened next? Did he succumb to shock, to blood loss, to the sheer horror of his violation? Or did he cling to life, defying even the cruelty of his assailants? Records from the time are fragmented, but some accounts suggest he did not die immediately. The human body, resilient even in the face of unimaginable pain, can endure more than we think. But endurance is not the same as survival. Infection would have set in swiftly. The risk of sepsis, of fever, of a slow, agonizing decline was high. If he lived, it would have been in excruciating torment, his body forever marked by the brutality inflicted upon him. And yet there are whispers that he lingered, that he was found, barely conscious, by those loyal to him, that he was smuggled away, hidden from those who sought to erase him completely. If true, his survival would have been a quiet act of defiance. But at what cost? A man broken in body and spirit, forced to live with the memory of his own mutilation. Other sources claim he perished within hours, his life bleeding out onto the cold stone where he had been left. No last words, no final act of courage, just silence. The truth may never be known, but one thing is certain: whether he lived or died, his suffering did not end with the blade. It echoed through history, a dark testament to the extremes of human cruelty, and it forces us to ask, what does it mean to survive such an atrocity? Is it victory, or merely a prolonged form of suffering? The moment the blade sliced through flesh, the nobleman's world shattered, not just in agony, but in the irreversible stripping of his identity. His testicles, severed with deliberate cruelty, were forced into his mouth, a grotesque mockery of his former power. This was not mere torture. This was annihilation. The nobleman, once a figure of influence, had made enemies in high places. His name, his lineage, his very existence had become a threat to those who saw him as an obstacle. The act was calculated, not just to break him, but to send a message. In an era where power was asserted through brutality, mutilation was more than punishment. It was political theater. The assailants were not common criminals. They were men with authority, acting under orders. The method was precise, almost ritualistic. The nobleman was restrained, his screams muffled, his body violated in a way that ensured he would never recover, not just physically but socially. In that moment, he was reduced to nothing more than a warning to others. Did he survive? If he did, it was a fate worse than death. A man stripped of his manhood, his dignity, his place in society, would have been a walking ghost.
The legal repercussions were minimal. Those who ordered the act were untouchable. The political landscape was one where such atrocities were quietly sanctioned, so long as they served the right interests. The public reaction was a mix of horror and grim acceptance. Some justified it as the price of defiance. Others whispered in fear, knowing that if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. The medical reality was bleak. Infection, shock, and the psychological toll would have been unbearable. But why this specific form of torture? Because it wasn't just about pain, it was about humiliation, about reducing a man to an object of ridicule and revulsion. It was a message written in blood and suffering. This is what happens to those who step out of line. The nobleman's legacy was forever stained. His family, if they survived, carried the weight of his mutilation, a name now synonymous with shame and defeat. In art and literature, his story might have been twisted into allegory or erased entirely, a footnote in the annals of brutality. And what does this tell us about power? That it has always been wielded with cruelty, that the line between justice and savagery is often drawn by the victors. This case is not an anomaly, it is a reflection of the darkness that lingers beneath the surface of history. So remember him, not as a victim, but as a testament to the price of defiance in a world where power demands absolute submission. The moment the blade sliced through flesh, the nobleman's world shattered. Not just his body, his dignity, his power, his very identity. The act was deliberate, calculated, meant to send a message far beyond the agony of one man. Public reaction was immediate, but not uniform. Shock rippled through the courts, the streets, the taverns. Some recoiled, clutching at their own bodies as if the horror could be contagious. Others whispered that justice had been served, that the mutilation was not just punishment, but poetic retribution. Rumors spread like wildfire. Had the nobleman's arrogance finally caught up with him? Had he crossed a line no title or wealth could shield him from? The brutality of the act forced people to take sides. Either this was an abomination, or it was deserved. There was no middle ground. In the halls of power, reactions were colder, more measured. Some nobles distanced themselves, fearing association. Others saw opportunity, a chance to exploit the chaos, to reposition themselves in the shifting tides of influence. The church, ever cautious, issued no formal condemnation, but priests privately debated whether such savagery could ever be divinely sanctioned. Among the common people, the story took on a life of its own. Some saw the nobleman's suffering as proof that even the mighty could fall. Others feared what it meant. If this could happen to a man of his station, what hope did they have? The streets buzzed with speculation, with outrage, with grim fascination, and then the silence. The whispers faded. The story was buried, not out of shame, but necessity, because the truth was too dangerous, because acknowledging the horror meant acknowledging the system that allowed it. So tell me, when history remembers cruelty, who gets to decide what was justice and what was simply vengeance? The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the muffled cries of a man who had once commanded respect. The nobleman, now reduced to a broken figure, lay writhing as his own flesh was turned against him, his testicles severed and forced into his mouth, a grotesque mockery of his former power. This was not just punishment, this was annihilation. The reaction of those who witnessed it, whether by choice or by cruel circumstance, rippled through the nobility and the common folk alike. Some whispered in horrified fascination, others turned away, unable to stomach the spectacle. But none could deny the message it sent: cross the wrong people, and even the highest among you will be brought low in the most humiliating way imaginable. For the nobility, it was a chilling reminder of their own fragility. Titles, lands, lineage, none of it mattered when raw brutality decided your fate. The act was designed not just to break the nobleman, but to shatter the illusion of invincibility that cloaked the aristocracy. Whispers spread through courtly halls. Had he truly deserved this? Or was this the work of a rival who had finally found the perfect way to erase him, body and legacy? The common people, though accustomed to violence in their own lives, recoiled at the sheer theatrical cruelty of it. This was not a hanging, not a simple execution. It was a performance, a lesson carved into flesh. Some saw it as justice, if the nobleman had been a tyrant. Others saw only the horror, the knowledge that if this could be done to a lord, what hope did they have? The event left scars beyond the physical. It became a dark legend, a story told in hushed tones, a warning wrapped in blood. And long after the nobleman's screams had faded, the memory of what was done to him lingered, a shadow over the kingdom, a stain that could not be washed away. Because in the end, the true punishment wasn't just what they did to him, it was what they made him, and everyone who heard of it. Remember, the records of this brutal act are scattered but chillingly consistent. Medieval chroniclers, often prone to exaggeration, wrote of the event with a rare solemnity, as if even they were shaken by its cruelty. The annals of St. Gall, a Frankish monastic chronicle, provides the most detailed account, describing the nobleman's punishment as a spectacle of divine wrath made flesh. A lesser-known but equally grim source is the letters of Bishop Hincmar, who referenced the mutilation in a missive to the Pope, calling it a warning written in blood. Even Arab historians, like al-Masudi, briefly noted the incident in their accounts of European barbarity, underscoring its notoriety beyond Christendom. But the most haunting testimony comes from a fragment of a personal diary attributed to a servant in the nobleman's household. Discovered in the 19th century in a crumbling Bavarian archive, it describes the aftermath. "My lord returned to us less a man than a spectre. His mouth stuffed with his own flesh, could not scream, only weep." The authenticity of this document is debated, but its visceral detail aligns with the broader historical record. What's striking is how deliberately the act was documented. This wasn't a hidden crime, it was a performance. Court scribes were likely present, their quills scratching as the sentence was carried out. The message was clear. Power wasn't just about inflicting pain, but about ensuring the pain was remembered. And remembered it was. For centuries, legal treatises cited the case as the extreme limit of punitive justice, a boundary even tyrants feared to cross again. Yet the question lingers: how much of what we know is fact, and how much is the embellishment of terrified chroniclers? The line between history and horror blurs here, and that perhaps was the point. History is littered with acts of brutality, meant not just to kill, but to erase a man's dignity, his legacy, even his very identity. And few punishments were as calculated, as personal, as the mutilation of noblemen who fell from grace. Take the case of Enguerrand de Marigny, a once powerful minister to King Philip IV of France, a man who rose from obscurity to become the right hand of the king until he wasn't. When Philip died, his enemies moved swiftly, accused of embezzlement, heresy, and sorcery, charges as convenient as they were dubious. De Marigny was hanged, his body left to rot, but his fate was far from unique. Then there was Hugh Despenser the Younger, favorite of King Edward II of England. His enemies didn't just want him dead, they wanted him unmade. Captured by Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, Despenser was subjected to a punishment so grotesque it was meant to serve as a warning for centuries. He was dragged through the streets, hanged, but cut down before death could claim him. Then came the knife. His genitals were sliced off and burned before his eyes, a deliberate act to strip him of masculinity, lineage, and honor. Only then was he beheaded, his body quartered and displayed across the kingdom. But perhaps the most chilling parallel comes from the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Justinian II, known as Rhinopenus the Slit-Nosed, was deposed in 695 AD. His nose was cut off, not just to disfigure him, but to render him unfit to rule. Byzantine law decreed that no mutilated man could sit on the throne, yet Justinian defied them. He returned years later, wearing a golden prosthetic, and reclaimed his empire in a brutal revenge that drowned his enemies in blood. These weren't just punishments, they were messages: to cut off a nobleman's testicles, to stuff them into his mouth, to disfigure him beyond recognition. These were acts designed to humiliate, to unmake a man in the eyes of God and society. Because in an era where power was tied to bloodline and divine right, destroying a man's body was the surest way to destroy his name forever. And yet, some of these men, in their mutilated state, still found ways to defy their tormentors. Which makes you wonder, what does it truly take to break a man? The body can be maimed, but the will to survive? That's far harder to extinguish. The nobleman's family did not escape the shadow of his mutilation. His name, once spoken with reverence, now carried the stench of humiliation. His sons, if he had any, would have borne the weight of their father's disgrace, their bloodline forever tainted by the brutality inflicted upon him. Inheritance, titles, alliances, all of it crumbled. No lord would marry his daughter to the son of a man whose testicles had been stuffed into his own mouth. No court would seat his descendants among the honored. The act wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. Records from the time are sparse, deliberately so. Chroniclers loyal to the perpetrators would have scrubbed his lineage from official histories, ensuring no future generation could reclaim dignity. If any relatives survived, they likely changed their names, fled to distant lands, or faded into obscurity. The nobleman's lands, confiscated, his wealth, divided among his enemies, his legacy, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of power. This is what happens when you defy us. But history has a way of preserving what others try to destroy. Fragments remain, court documents with glaring omissions, letters that hint at the unfortunate business without naming it, genealogies with suspicious gaps. Scholars today still debate whether his line truly ended, or if descendants lived on in silence, carrying the shame like a hidden scar. And what of the perpetrators? Did they sleep soundly after ensuring his name would rot? Perhaps, but power shifts, dynasties fall, and sometimes the very act meant to extinguish a legacy ensures it is never forgotten.
The nobleman's mutilation was a message, but messages can be read in more ways than one. Centuries later, we're still speaking of him. That in itself is a kind of vengeance. The act of stuffing a nobleman's severed testicles into his own mouth wasn't just brutality, it was a message. A calculated, grotesque declaration of power meant to echo through history, and it did. This nobleman, whose name has been whispered in horror for centuries, was no minor figure. He was a man of influence, a player in the deadly games of court politics. His exact identity varies by account, but what remains consistent is his fall from grace. Whether he betrayed a king, insulted a rival, or simply stood in the wrong man's way, his fate was sealed in the most humiliating manner imaginable. The punishment was not random. Castration alone would have been enough to strip him of his masculinity, his legacy, his very place in the world. But the act of forcing his own flesh into his mouth, that was symbolic annihilation. It was a statement: you are nothing. Your lineage ends here. Your name will be remembered only in disgrace. The method was as deliberate as it was savage. Accounts suggest he was restrained, likely by men who knew him, perhaps even former allies. The cutting would have been swift, the pain unimaginable, but the true horror came after. As he choked on his own mutilated flesh, the message was clear to all who witnessed it: cross the wrong powers, and this is what awaits. Did he survive? Some sources claim he lived long enough to suffer the humiliation publicly before succumbing to infection or blood loss. Others say he was left to wander, a broken specter of the man he once was. Either way, his fate sent shockwaves through the nobility. Laws didn't change overnight, but the precedent was set. Punishment could be as much about spectacle as justice. This wasn't just an execution, it was theater, and the audience was every noble who ever thought themselves untouchable. The question that lingers isn't just why it happened, but how many others, lost to history, suffered the same. Imagine a nobleman, once powerful, now broken, forced to taste his own manhood as his executioners laugh. This was not just torture, this was annihilation. The victim was a man of rank, a figure whose name once commanded respect. His exact identity remains debated. Some chronicles point to a disgraced advisor, others to a rebellious lord who dared challenge the throne. What is certain is that he had enemies, powerful ones, and in an era where punishment was as much spectacle as justice, his fate was designed to send a message. The reasons: treason perhaps, or personal vendetta. Maybe he slept with the wrong man's wife, or maybe he simply stood in the way of a ruler's ambition. Whatever the cause, his punishment was not just about ending his life, it was about erasing his dignity, his legacy, even his masculinity. The act itself was methodical. He was restrained, likely stripped publicly to amplify the humiliation. The castration would have been crude, a knife, a cleaver, something brutal and efficient. The pain would have been unbearable, but worse was what came next. His own severed flesh shoved into his mouth, a grotesque mockery of consumption, a symbol: you are nothing, not even a man. Did he survive the initial mutilation? Unlikely. Shock alone would have claimed most. But if he lived even minutes longer, those moments would have been agony. Physical, yes, but worse, the crushing weight of degradation. His last sight, the faces of those who did this, watching, satisfied. The reaction, silence from some, horror from others. But no one intervened, because in that world, cruelty was power, and power was law. Today, historians still argue, was this event literal, or was it propaganda, a tale exaggerated to terrify dissenters? Some point to fragmented accounts, others dismiss it as myth, but the story persists, because whether fact or fable, it reveals a truth about humanity, our capacity for cruelty, and the lengths we'll go to break one another. And so we're left with a question: what terrifies you more, that this happened, or that it could happen again?